As you can guess, this isn't my story. It was told to me through sips of whiskey and packed cigars. I can't vouch for the exact details, but I'll try to tell the story as it was told to me. My uncle grew up in the 60s and 70s, in a house full of kids and with a friend group consisting of stoners and underage drinkers. He was close with almost all of them, except for a guy we'll call Dan. My uncle and Dan never got along well. Apparently Dan had dated my aunt and broken her heart. One day, the group went camping in the old woods across town. The trek was arduous. There were lots of fallen trees, low-hanging branches to Dakanda and the narrow river. They needed to find a way around. My uncle was the one leading them to their campsite, an out-of-place clearing that almost looked purposeful. When retelling this story, he said they had been complaining all the way there, but became practically all struck at the sight. The clearing was more of a meadow. Beautiful flowers and tall, luscious trees formed a large ring around them. As they unloaded their packs, it took them until dusk to fully set up their camp for the next 3 days. The group huddled around a campfire as night fell, telling stories and reminiscing about childhood long into the night. Someone had snuck some whiskey into their pack and was passing it around to everyone when my uncle heard the tale about a cave nearby. The story talks about a group of kids who went hiking in the mountains, only for one of them to return. Shell-shocked and traumatized, the kid was never able to tell the police exactly where to find his 2 friends. A hush fell over the group and our knees spread. Something about that story unsettled even my uncle, a known skeptic. The group called an early night and turned in for restless sleep. My uncle had a dream that night. In his dream, he was the young child from the story. He was trekking up a steep incline, followed by 2 of his friends, Susan and Fred. It had just rained, and the mud was slippery under their boots. He looked back at the 2, following his lead, and said something inaudible as a flash of lightning crashed nearby. Soon, booming thunder shook the very ground they walked on. The 3 marched onward as dark clouds loomed overhead, threatening to unleash a mighty downpour. After what felt like hours of walking in place, the earth leveled out as they reached a small clearing. The 3 children stood facing the mouth of a cave, and when they peeked inside, a sharp drop-off beckoned them closer. Susan grabbed my uncle by the arm, but her voice was drowned as another flash of lightning was followed by more roaring thunder. The darkness urged my uncle ever closer. Arm-like tendrils reached for him out of the darkness as he took another step toward the cliff edge. He could hear whispers from the pit. The voices yelled incessantly for a sacrifice. My uncle awoke from his nightmare, with sweat rolling down his back and labored breathing. The sun had yet to rise, and all that was heard was the gentle snoring from his friends in the neighboring tents. Deciding he needed a breather, my uncle crawled out of his tent and into the warm night air, admiring the stars that were clearer and brighter than he'd ever seen, like tiny faraway flashlights in the sky. "Beautiful, aren't they?" said a soft voice beside him, snapping him from his thoughts as he turned to face Susan. "I've never seen the stars this bright." "Yeah, they're really something else." He smiled at Susan. "What did you think of that story?" she said, abruptly turning to my uncle with a curious gaze. "The one about the kids?" he asked. He had almost forgotten the story and the dream that followed. Dan always has good stories? Doesn't he? Quote, I guess. He paused before recalling his strange dream. I had a nightmare. A look of wonder dawned on Susan's face. You too. Her attention was no longer on the stars. My uncle looked at her questioningly. Are you messing with me? Quote, what? Number, I had a nightmare too. I woke up in a cold sweat and everything. Susan put her hands up defensively. Just then stepped out of his tent. His hair disheveled from sleep. The two stared at him as he rubbed his eyes. You two are loud talkers, you know. He spoke with a yawn. I think you're just a light sleeper, Susan said, rolling her eyes. Dan shrugged and sat in one of the fold-up chairs, surrounding the now burnt-out campfire. He looked up at the stars. Man, would you look at that? He smiled. I was just saying the same thing. My uncle said, sitting beside Dan. Susan stayed standing but looked up at the stars, too. The three stayed like that for a few minutes, enjoying the cold breeze that the night brought. Susan placed an arm on Don's shoulder and yawned. That story gave us nightmares. She smiled down at him. Dan seemed proud of himself and looked over at my uncle. You too, Thomas. Quote, my uncle only nodded, breaking his gaze from the stars to look at his feet. Yeah, it was strange. He said, we were walking up the trail to that cave, Susan. Me and Fred. I had that same dream. Susan cut in. I was leading Thomas and Fred to some dark cave. And every time I tried to speak, thunder would drown out my voice. She explained her dream to them. My uncle's blood ran cold as he heard Susan explain the exact dream he had. It was the same, except he had led the two. My uncle looked back at the tents, at Fred's tent that he shared with his girlfriend Amy. He could still hear Fred's gentle snoring. The boy was fast asleep, oblivious to everything. Hey, what if we went to that cave? Dan interjected. Susan and my uncle stared at him as if he were crazy. Dan only laughed as he urged the two to consider it. At least I know where it is. We could go there in the morning. With a mischievous smile, he said. Or we could go right now. Quote, my uncle swallowed and bounced his leg, not wanting to chicken out. He wanted to impress Susan. He'd had feelings for her all summer. Her woven hair and light freckles that danced across her caramel skin. Her brown eyes with hints of gold always looked at him with humor whenever she would prompt adventure. It was her idea to go camping. Let's go right now before the others wake up. Susan agreed, and the two looked at my uncle expectantly. Hi, all right, Fine. Let's be quick, though. He gave in and stood up. Susan passed down the lantern, and the three headed away from camp. The lantern and the moon gave them just enough light to see where they placed their feet as they hiked up what was slowly becoming a mountain to where Dan said the cave was. It was dark, but by the time they had reached a small clearing on the steep hill, the sun had begun to rise behind them. Is it here? Asked Susan, not nearly out of breath as the other two should be. Answered Dan, raising the lantern as he spun around, surveying their surroundings. My uncle groaned in exhaustion. Are you sure it's even real? Quote, I'm positive. Dan called back to him. The three looked around the small clearing before Dan called my uncle and Susan over to him. I found it, he said triumphantly. as the two walked over to him. All they could see was foliage. But, as Dan pushed back the leaves, they laid their eyes on the mouth of a dark cave. The entrance was only a couple of feet tall, and extremely narrow yet as the three appeared inside, they could see it opened up into a vast cavern. "Should we? I don't know. Go inside," Dan asked cautiously. A gust of hot air was continuously coming from the cavern. The other two was silent, as they shared glances of unease. My uncle was the first to respond, wanting to impress Susan with his bravery. "Let's go inside," he spoke, looking at Susan expectantly. "I'm sure it's fine." Saying Susan agreed, and soon the three of them ducked into the cave. Upon entering, the three were hit by a wall of foul-smelling hot air. The inside of the cave was dark and seemed to swallow any light provided by the lantern. The three expected to see bats come flying out as they entered like in the cartoons. Instead, all they saw was empty darkness. They did not move as they surveyed the cavern. Only then did they see. They were standing on the edge of a steep drop-off. "Whoa," Susan remarked, staring at the pit. "Wouldn't want to fall down there." Dan joked, trying to make light of the situation. My uncle said nothing. He was practically transfixed by the inky darkness that threatened to spill over onto the edge he stood on. "It smells awful here," Dan spoke nasally as he pinched his nose. "Yeah, did something die?" Susan followed Don's action. "It's the pit," my uncle said finally. "It's from my nightmare." Susan and Dan stared at my uncle as he stepped toward the darkness. They wanted to say something, grab him and pull him back. Back and out of this cave they felt they never should have entered. As Dan reached to pull him back, he caught a glimpse at exactly what my uncle was surrendering himself to. No, a monstrous thing of nightmares. Whether it was an animal or a being of divine creation, my uncle was not sure. But it called to him. It spoke to him incoherently, in a language long forgotten by time. It yearned for a feast, it yearned for him. My uncle internally screamed, but his body had long since abandoned him. He was a prisoner in his mind, with a body that betrayed his every command. Thomas Dan yanked my uncle by the arm, back towards the cave entrance. "No, the pit. The darkness," he shouted as he fought against Don's attempt to the rescue. Tendrils of darkness pulled him closer to the pit. They were stronger than the two of them. Yet in one last attempt to gain control over his body, my uncle decided the pit needed to be fed, or else it would not let the three go. Susan and Dan stared at my uncle. He shouted over the voices from the pit and pulled Dan closer, yanking him to the edge, before finally shoving the boy into the pit. As if like a switch, the voices stopped. The tendrils receded, and all that was left were my uncle and Susan. He looked around the cave and picked up the lantern, searching for Susan as he realized she was no longer in the cavern. "Susan," he called out for her. He exited the cave's darkness and saw Susan huddled against a tree, staring at the mouth expectantly. The two said nothing to each other as they tracked down the mountain, sharing only glances in a silent agreement that what happened back there would never be spoken of. At least that was until now. As I said, I cannot vouch for the events of this story. My uncle is an old couch-hopping drunk who, although I love him, isn't known to be the most coherent man. I hope you all enjoyed this story. I know my uncle has many more that I may transcribe in the future. I've been babysitting all summer in order to make some extra cash. At first, I just asked around at school if anyone needed a babysitter for their siblings, or if they knew anyone who could be interested. I started babysitting kids whose families I knew. But eventually I needed more money, so I put up an ad on Craigslist. It wasn't long until I got a response. The family lived in the suburbs, but what bothered me was how close to the woods their house was and the fact that they didn't have any neighbors. I got a bit freaked out at first, considering the fact that they were strangers with a cabin in the woods, but decided to push through the fear for the money. The house was a cozy little cabin, clean with a garden in the back. That had a gate which led to a trail in the woods. They had little lanterns hung out in the garden, and a swing all the way in the back. The living room had a large window that faced directly the forest, and during the day, the room was bathed in sunlight. The kitchen was right next to it, with its counter facing another huge window, surrounded by pots and vines and stupid signs like, "Home is where the family is," or "In this house we say sorry." Upstairs, they only had the 2 bedrooms. The attic was a tiny space whose window faced the woods, too. The kid was pretty quiet, honestly. I neither liked or disliked him. I tried to form some sort of opinion, but he just didn't stand out in any way. He wasn't mean or stubborn, but he wasn't a sweetheart either. He must have been around 5 or 6, so I would just put him to bed quickly and then snoop around the house. I've always been curious about whoever hired me, and I know it's not exactly recommended, but I would just go through people's stuff whenever I felt bored. It must have been around midnight that night when I slowly pulled out one of the drawers in the main bedroom. This one had all types of trinkets, coins, notebooks, pins, buttons. This family liked to collect useless stuff and let it hang around the house, and I liked to explore it. As I was studying this little ceramic statue of a horse, I moved it around, noticing the moonlight hit its porcelain from different angles. I debated whether to just take it or not. Would they even notice? My chest tightened and my mouth opened. The horse was no longer bathed in moonlight, because this huge shadow had covered it and was dancing on its porcelain. Looking around a bit, I noticed the shadow took up half the room. I could not make out the silhouette, or what could have made it. It just seemed so unexpected that fear crept up to me and froze me. Someone was at the window. I know it could have been a bird. That's the rational explanation. And I could have solved all this doubt by just looking up. But I didn't, because what if it wasn't a bird? I stood still for so long, not knowing what to do until it passed, and the horse was lit up again by the moonlight. I breathed a sigh of relief and put the horse in my pocket. I didn't know at the time, but that would have been my first contact with it. Something made me stop snooping around and just get downstairs. I turned on the TV and curled up on the couch. At one point during the night, I heard creaking upstairs. I know it shouldn't have freaked me out so bad, but I still got scared, so I went to check it out. The house was dark and quiet, and the 2 bedrooms facing each other were empty. Empty. Where did the kid go? Jason, my voice pierced the silence, and I felt like an intruder, destroying the quiet of the night. Jason, where did you go? I kept having the feeling of being watched, So I turned around, fixated on the attic door, which was now opened. My instincts kept telling me to just leave, but my head, now spinning, refused. What if we had an intruder? What if he'd taken Jason? If I had just looked up at the window when the shadow passed, now I'd know what I was dealing with. If I just had the courage to face it. My voice sounded a lot weaker than the first time, but I still had to try. Jason. Yeah. The response was almost immediate, and coming from the attic. Odd, what was he doing there? I put my foot on the first step of the stairs. What are you doing there? It's really late. Your parents are going to be home soon. Step after step, I tried to readjust my eyes to the darkness. The attic was really dark compared to the rest of the house, and I could make out a ray of light that traced out this tiny silhouette. Jason, are you there? What are you doing? You are freaking me out. I finally reached him and put my hands on his tiny shoulders, but he didn't respond. He was just staring out the tiny window into the woods. What's going on? I asked. What are you looking at? I sat next to him and stared out the window at the woods. There was a portion of grass beginning from the house, pierced by trees. The farther you went, the denser the trees were, until you discover you were completely surrounded by the woods, unable to see the sky from how tight the branches closed around you. The forest commenced from the garden and swallowed the horizon like a dark mass blending with the sky. The window framed this darkness, this suffocating emptiness, and made me feel as if we'd reached the end of the world, and had we dared to venture into the forest, we'd just fall over the face of the earth. And there stood Jason, just staring. What are you seeing? He just wouldn't answer, so I decided to find out by myself. Studying the scenery, nothing particular stood out. Of course, I just needed to pay more attention. Yeah, the more you looked, the more movement you saw. Birds, animals. Even the wind thrilled the branches and the leaves, the grass swaying gently. And then the shadows were the next thing you noticed. These forever moving stains on the ground. I could have stared out there for years. Maybe that's why Jason wasn't moving. There's just something about the night that keeps you up. What do you think lurks out there? I asked him playfully. We're in the woods. Yeah, my mom. I blinked a few times. That was unsettling. I mean, kids say weird stuff. But why would you respond to that? Was that a your mom joke? Was he trying to be funny? What do you mean? What does lurk mean? Lurk means, well, when you wait or move slowly in the darkness, because you don't want to be seen. So, like hiding. Yeah, but you're lurking when you also want to do something bad. Just how animals look before they attack all monsters. I added, trying to scare him. So, what do you think looks out there in the forest? My mother, he responded once again. My body tensed up. That's not funny. I don't want to be funny. Why would you say that, your mom? That's an old joke, and it stopped being funny a while ago. I'm not joking. Okay, let's go to sleep. Your mother can't be lurking out there. I saw her and she's pretty nice. I don't know what she told you, but she doesn't eat people. She's out with your dad now, and they gonna come home in a few hours. If they find out you aren't sleeping, I'll get a lot of shit for it. Shit. Don't tell your parents I said that. Come on, let's get down. I'm telling the truth. What, is she a vampire? You know, something was standing at the window earlier. I didn't really care that much about what I was saying, because in my head everything had a logical explanation. Jason, however, widened his gaze. Yeah, that could have been her stop. I'm serious, and what does she want from us? Does she want to eat me? We were now in his bedroom, and I had tucked him into bed. I had my back to the window facing the hallway, which had now become way creepier than expected. She doesn't want to eat you. That's so great, I taste horrible. Good night. I tried to stand up and leave, but he grabbed me. Wait, don't go, look at me. What now? I want to tell you about this dream. I had this dream that woke me up. But you have to pay attention, okay? So, in my dream I was in the garden and I was thirsty. And you were there too, and you tried to leave. But there were a lot of bushes around and you got lost. And I found this poppet. I hate it when people tell me about their dreams. But I sat there listening, facing Jason with my back to the window. Not because his story was interesting. Not because I liked being there. Because while he held me there, his eyes kept darting to the window, and I'd seen the shadow cover his face. Because he'd insisted I looked at him, but in reality, he didn't want me to turn around. So I listened until he abruptly finished his story, when moonlight reached his face again. Thank you for the story. It was really interesting. You're welcome. Good night, night. I spent the next hour in the other bedroom, fidgeting with the little porcelain horse. This kid was a lot braver than I thought. In the silence, I kept trying to make out distinct, unfamiliar sounds, but didn't succeed. The house had fallen asleep, and the night had become uneventful. His parents arrived soon after that. I put the horse in my pocket and went downstairs to greet them. Was he good, Keith? Yeah, the best. Don't worry, I studied both of them head to toe. Their clothes, mannerisms, facial expressions. But mostly the mom. Were you good? Asked the dad jokingly. I hope so. I responded they wanted to drive me home, but I insisted on taking my bike. I closed the door behind me, but instead of leaving I headed to the backyard. I just wanted to see something. Climbing on the fence, I made it on the roof of the porch, right next to the bedroom window, hoping to see some signs of something, anything. The window was covered in scratches, but nothing gave out what had been there. I stood there for a while. I don't know why. The parents had gone to sleep, and Jason was probably asleep in his room too. I studied the garden from that angle, then the woods as quiet as a mouse, then the room where the parents was sleeping after that. I don't remember how I got home. I don't even think I took my bike, just ran frantically until my legs bled. I didn't even scream, I didn't look around or stop. Just ran until I reached my house and banged on the door. My mother answered annoyed, and I ran past her right to my bedroom, covered myself in my blanket and started typing this. because while I was watching the parents sleep, something had caught my eye in the hallway. What I had there to be a coat hanger moved all of a sudden. It had been standing there so still, I hadn't even bothered to notice it, until this appeared out of my range, then appeared again. This bony twisted silhouette dragged itself into the bedroom and stood right next to the mother, who was sleeping. It looked uncanny, like a human who would starve to death, with wide eyes and arms so long they trailed behind it. When it walked, it just stood there watching the parents, then lifted a bony finger and started counting. I stood there frozen watching this horrifying show, forever scarred in my head. It kept counting and counting and counting. I was so scared to move that I would have watched it forever. It wasn't until something else happened that made me break into this exhausting run. It saw me,